This is the first of what we're calling an informal talk series. Hopefully we'll be able to do this informally. This is not to be confused with the public lecture series that we do the middle Friday of every month, which some of you would have been to. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Karen today to you. Karen and I have been in touch for maybe a little over a year and a half, I think. Thanks to another colleague at Stanford who put me in touch with her saying you have to go meet her, and which is what I promptly did, and I could see why they mentioned it. They have an extraordinary lab. I went with envy, and now I'm just sort of mesmerized by what they have done over the last many decades, and of course Karen will talk a little bit about that. So this is a very informal conversation. So she's going to be talking about her work both here and in Haiti. And I'll introduce her in a little bit moment, but I think there's not as much of a conversation in the country around preservation and conservation of paper-based, or broadly paper or photographs. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around, I would say, heritage structure, but I haven't seen as much around material like this, so I thought it would be just a good conversation to have. I'm just going to take the opportunity, since I have a captive audience and 3 or 4 more people trooping in. The conservation community is very interesting to me. I just find this I'm part of this listserv. I was just telling Karen, and I'm just very moved by their attention to things despite everything else that's going on. So I'm part of this listserv where there's this conservator of the University of Hong Kong Library, and as most of you know, what's been happening in Hong Kong over the last year, and of course a lot of it has been happening in India as well. And this person is, just in the midst of all this, has sent out this query. I'm seeking advice on how to handle library collections, and multiple types of tear gas were used, not able to verify the specific chemicals involved, and this is just sent out to a global listserv. And the response from the community is instant. And it's just very humbling to see this kind of a back and forth, where someone is actually trying to triage it out and say, this is what I think the tear gas was, and this is what I think you need to do to address it. So, independent of everything else that is going on in the public, there is also this background conversation that is happening. So I was just very moved by this dialogue that I saw, and I was just a bystander looking at those dialogues. So I love, seeing the work that conservators do, and I'm really looking forward to this talk by Karen. So I'll move to first just a second, and I will close it here. So Karen has been a paper conservator in private practice for many decades. Her expertise encompasses a full range of work on paper, from the 15th century all the way up to contemporary pieces. She's been responsible for many collections, including fine art, archival material, maps, historic currency, and rare books, both in private hands and in institutions. The studio that she founded and runs is involved in both conservation and preservation treatments. She and her staff repair damaged items, but they also provide information in extending the life of an object. And I think this is something that we would love to sort of hear a little bit more about. Karen has trained both pre- and post-program conservation interns for over 30 years and lectures widely to the general public. Her group, the Zukor Art Conservation, is based in Oakland, California, where I had the good fortune of meeting her. And I do hope you give her a warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you guys. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. I thought you would enjoy this because it's paper fibers under magnification, and I thought it would be a good intro. Thank you for coming. I'm really delighted to talk to you today about my work, some of which I think would be important to the archive. My practice does involve a very wide range of work on paper. A large part of it is art, prints, for example, lithographs, woodcuts, engravings, etchings, but also drawings, watercolors, pastels, posters. So a great deal of art, antique maps, rare books, and then in terms of archival material, we actually work on a great deal of letters, ledgers, manuscripts, all kinds of things, diaries. We did some Civil War diaries, as a matter of fact, but a lot of things on paper. So a wide range of paper-based artifacts. And I'm going to show you a little bit of both. but I'm starting out with some more archival material just to give you an idea of some of the issues that we face. Those of you involved in conservation already know that the most important thing is the quality of the paper that we start with. And very often we get things into our lab that are quite damaged, quite fragile and brittle, and we have to put them back into a condition where if they can't be handled, they can at least be stabilized. So this is one of a number of pamphlets we did of the National Geographic magazine, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's a terrific publication that's been around since the 1800s. And when it was originally originally published, it didn't have the nice slick covers that National Geographic has now. It has this very thin, brittle paper that was just on the top. And it has suffered quite a bit. We had a number of them where the margins were essentially missing, and they had also detached from the pamphlet. So what we tried to do was give them some kind of stability. We used a dyed Japanese paper to back them. We had a wide range of colors from the pamphlets. They were all in this kind of orangey red. So we chose one that pretty much would blend in with all of them, but we wanted at least our repair papers to be uniform. And this just gives you an idea of what we try to do is return this cover to a square so it can be put back. This is the same issue. The cover's been put back on, it's been tipped back on, so the piece can then be whole. These magazines were then housed in a clamshell box altogether. Now, they're still not easily handleable because there's only so much strengthening you can do with the paper. But we have at least given them some support with a Japanese paper lining. I'll talk a little bit more about Japanese paper, which we use almost exclusively in our repair. The reason is it's thin, it's strong, flexible, it's manufactured from very high quality fibers, and it doesn't rely on the thickness of a paper sheet to give it strength. So you'll see very often in this presentation that we've used Japanese papers for mending, for backing, etc. I love this slide because this piece is so extreme that when it came into my studio by a private person, I almost laughed. I thought, what am I going to do with this? It's not terribly old. As you can see, it's from 1921. It was a naturalization certificate, but over the years, it had been repaired repeatedly with lengths of various tapes. The tapes had not only stained and aged quite poorly, but there had also been a fair amount of loss of paper around edges. This is the back. The back has almost more tape than the front. And this is all what we refer to as pressure-sensitive tape. Not water-soluble, but tape that forms a bond simply by manual pressure. So Scotch tape, masking tape, all those terrible tapes that we never want you to use. When this came in, I was dubious as to how much we could actually repair, but this is what it looked like at the end. We were able to remove all of the tape, front and back, using organic solvents, using heat, using a lot of mechanical action with a scalpel by scraping, and then we put it back together. There's still a lot of loss, but again, we wanted to return it back to its original shape. This is what the back looks like. It shows that there is a Japanese paper backing over the whole thing, holding it together, because it was too fragile to really exist as a single document on its own. And also the fills that we used. You can see, particularly along the top margin, we needed to fill those areas so the piece had some kind of structural integrity, without losing any of the manuscript ink, I might add. So we're particularly pleased with this. This is another item that comes into us fairly often. It's a hand-drawn genealogical document that was actually hand-painted on a piece of poor quality board, a thin board, which over time, because it was acidic and brittle, simply broke off. And we had a number of the pieces, and we put them back together to restore again the wholeness of that piece. This one's much easier than the one you saw prior. Again, the adhesive that we used to put those corners back on was a wheat starch paste. We only use an adhesive that's reversible. We only use really a starch-based adhesive because we have a mandate that we can't do anything that isn't easily or hopefully removed in the future. So we can't use any synthetic adhesives. And this is also supported with Japanese tissue on the back, again, applied with starch paste. I am going to show you some pieces that never could be fully restored. And I will say, in terms of conservation, in the US, we do make a very clear distinction between conservation and restoration. We don't really try to make an item on paper look the way it was when it was initially manufactured. Our job is to remove whatever damaging material has been added to it, whether that's dirt or stains or tape or soot from a fire, such as this, or rust. But we don't try to pretend that we can make it look good as new. We just want to physically and chemically stabilize that piece so the information can be available, so the book can be read, so the art can be enjoyed. This is a fairly small certificate from 1871 that was stored in a metal box which had moisture gotten into it, so it was stained, brittle, and it had some rust and other metal corrosion from having been in a box. And this was about as much of the staining that we could remove. And we were happy enough with it because, again, the information is available. We didn't promise the owner that we would make it perfect. We also made sure that in treating the paper, so much of what we do is to try to make the paper stronger. We very often have clients who come in and say, can you make it look better? And our desire is to make it last longer. Now, luckily, the procedures for those are the same. Whatever removes the staining and the discoloration and other damage that's been done to it will also help make it stronger. So it's kind of a win-win. We just have to convince them to have it done. This, again, was this funny little broadside from the 19th century that had been stuck on the side of a building, very stained, tells you not to spit, and that's as much as we could do to flatten it out, remove some of the stains, clean it up. Now this actually did not get any kind of backing. It didn't need it. The paper in and of itself was fairly damaged, but was substantial enough that it didn't need any additional support. One of the things we are very clear about is we only put a backing or a lining on something if it really needs it to hold it together. We don't try to add anything to a paper artifact if it's not necessary. So we often are asked, can you strengthen it? Can you put a backing on it? And our answer is it doesn't really need it. If it needs it, we'll do it. If the piece is fragmented or fractured enough, or so thin and fragile that it really needs an additional support, we will do that. But when it doesn't, we want to retain the piece in its original state as much as possible. We don't mount things onto boards because then we turn them into boards. This is also a piece of parchment that we do work on occasionally, not paper, not cellulose, but we do get quite a bit of parchment. This is a large coral sheet, made large so the choir can see what's going on. And I'll just point out in these slides, so these are all our studio slides. So the little magnets that you see in the corners, that's how we photograph everything. We do before and after photographs of all our work. Occasionally we do in-progress photos also. But we do it up on a magnetic board because it's really the easiest way to get something in a place where we can stabilize it. So if you see these funny little magnets in the corner, and some of them are more obvious than others, that's what they are. This being parchment, the only thing it really needed was some dry cleaning and humidification and flattening. Parchment does not willingly want to go flat. So we humidify it for a long time and then we press it. And then very often we have to repeat that process multiple times, wrestle it to the ground until we can get it flat. We also always tell clients when they bring in something of parchment, and you will see another document here, that like cellulose, like paper, but more so, it's extremely reactive to temperature and humidification and humidity changes. It always wants to move. So we very often will put a mat on it to help keep it flat. Just to show you some of the kinds of art that we have, and more importantly, the kinds of issues we have. So the biggest enemy, of course, of paper is acid, but also humidity, insects, human beings, all of those things that can really, really damage paper. We see many pieces that come in where they've been matted, framed in acidic materials. And over time, the acid in those mats, those paper mats, will be absorbed by the paper and leave fairly disfiguring stains. It's referred to as mat burn being that line of discoloration that you see outside, and it represents not just stain, but it represents damage to the paper. So it does mean the paper is more degraded in that area, and the important thing is, can we remove it so the paper is healthier and the drawing can be viewed in its entirety. We didn't cut the drawing off, it came off like this. In order to remove that acidic stain, we simply put the drawing through a series of alkaline water baths. So we change the chemistry of the paper to try to remove the damaging problem. And it's a slow process because we always start out with a neutral pH water bath, if something can be immersed. And then each subsequent water bath, the pH is elevated a little bit more. We don't do anything in huge leaps. We do it in very small leaps. And then as the piece washes, and hopefully some of that stain comes out, we take it out, we let it dry, we monitor it before we proceed with another treatment. So nothing is fast. In fact, conservation is exceedingly slow. But it has to be carefully monitored throughout, and it is particularly important that we make sure that we are seeing what the results are from each treatment that we perform. Because when paper is wet, it looks very different than when it's dry. Now we're showing you a little bit more art, but this is a watercolor, late 19th century that was glued down to a board with animal glue, with hide glue. And then a window mat, the mat that covered the front margins, was also glued to it. Now, the animal glue is dissolvable in water. It's dissolvable in warm water. But this is a watercolor, so we can't exactly put this artifact in water and expect it to lose this tremendous amount of adhesive that was around the edge. So we had to proceed very slowly, using damp cotton swabs around the perimeter initially to remove the glue from the front. Then, to get it off the board, we delaminate the board. We turn the watercolor over, we weight it so it can't move, and we literally peel the board off in layers. Eventually, we're going to get to the back of the watercolor where we can use some moisture to remove that last layer of glue, but we can't directly add water to it because it would take much too long to penetrate through the board, and we wouldn't be able to monitor what's going on with the watercolor on the front. So this is where the really laborious part of conservation comes in, but if you're a conservator, you actually really like this. It's kind of meditative. You're literally peeling off or scalpeling off the board in layers, if you're lucky. And this is what it looked like at the end. We didn't really know how much of the watercolor extended into the margins that were covered. It's one of those things that we're not privy to. But this is what it looked like afterwards. Quite a lovely piece, and it wasn't that large, but it had an awful lot of adhesive on it. This again is another one of those problems where the media is water sensitive, or what we call friable, meaning it's not well, it's dried out, it's not well attached to the actual paper support. This is an opaque watercolor and charcoal by a very famous modern artist, Mondrian. This is a very early piece of his, and it hadn't been treated particularly well either. It had been folded up and put in a frame. There were some missing portions along the bottom, and it was dirty. We dry cleaned it, and with that we used literally soft erasers, non-abrasive erasers, or what we call eraser crumbs. So we take very soft erasers and we grate them on a cheese grater, so we get a really fine, soft powder that we can use in a more selective way, in a more selective motion, rather than something with a hard edge. So we cleaned it, and then again, because that bottom margin wasn't fully present, we did fill it. In this case, we actually filled it with Western paper because it was more appropriate for this particular piece. We weren't trying to match the paper of the drawing. We just wanted to make it a fully formed sheet. And the owners didn't want us to try to pretend that we were putting in the bottom part of that drawing. So we actually were very happy with this beautiful piece. Oh, okay, so now we're back to parchment. This is a diploma that was in a frame, but it got wet. I think the frame was actually at some point taken off the wall, placed on the floor. There was a flood, and the whole bottom part was really quite soaked. And it wasn't just that parts of it, which were attached to a board, were missing. It was wildly warped, as I think you can see. And when something like this comes in, they're very, very difficult to photograph, and they're very difficult to handle because you have two different states of health, basically. The top part of the document was perfectly fine. The bottom part was brittle, discolored, very, very compromised. So what we were able to do after we flattened it out, because again, you can't wash parchment, you can't do a wet cleaning really, is we filled the missing areas with layers of Japanese paper, again applied with starch paste, and got it to go flat. So we could once again get it into a mat. Just so you'll know, we did remove the seal, it was a paper seal, because very often you can't really have more than one kind of paper on there. This was a paper seal on parchment, so we were able to remove it intact and then put it back when the piece was done. And we matted it because it was the only way it was ever going to stay flat over time. If we had left it in the state after conservation, it would have had a tendency to want to curl up again. It wouldn't have become quite as distorted as it had been when it came in, but it would remain reactive in the same way that paper does. So the most important issue about paper, and it's something we tell our clients all the time, is it is not an inert material. It is not dead. It will always respond to fluctuations in temperature and humidity. It will always expand a little when it gets damp. It'll shrink back when it gets dry, and it will continue to have those kinds of fluctuations, those dimensional changes for as long as it's in existence. You do want to limit them as much as possible by putting it in some kind of housing that protects it from them. This was a drawing, again, that was in a fire. Unfortunately, being in California, we have had some really terrible fires in the last decade. And most of the time, to be honest, the art doesn't survive at all. Almost everything is lost. This particular piece, the glass within the frame cracked, and the piece got somewhat stained, but most of it was salvaged. And this is a charcoal, which means it's loosely affixed. It's a drawing media that's loosely affixed to the paper, so easily smeared, can't be wet cleaned very easily unless under suction. It has some very strange corners that had been attached to it prior to it coming in, and it was a little bit uneven in color, but we were able to humidify it in a chamber just to get it to relax, and then do a little damp cleaning under suction. So we have a suction table, which is simply a table with a series of perforated surfaces that's attached to a wet-dry vacuum. So it pulls moisture straight through to the back. Now this is good for either water or organic solvents or whatever you want to apply to paper and not want it to spread, because as you know, when you get any kind of moisture onto paper, capillary action pulls it out this way. The suction table pulls it straight through and allows you to localize the treatment. So we were able to, for example, spray the back of this, lay it on the suction table face up, and pull some of the discoloration out of the back without even having to spray through the majority of the drawing. Couldn't live without the suction table. So those little black bars, again, are our magnets, but she turned out pretty well. Now, back to archives. We do have a number of clients who bring us things like these record books. This is from Hawaii, and very poorly housed for a number of years. It's a record-keeping book that someone had repaired with Scotch tape. my favorite. Actually, masking tape is worse than Scotch tape. And this is all handwritten, all manuscript ink, and it was bound in a kind of a cover that was paper over boards, but it had also broken. And there was only so much we could do with this. The owner wanted us to repair the pages as much as possible and then put it into some kind of container so it could be saved. He wasn't necessarily going to be leafing through this. It wasn't something that was going to be read. It was going to be digitized. He had every page photographed. So there is a record separate from the piece. But many times items like this can't be fully restored to a condition where they can be leafed through and read. They simply are too fragile to begin with. This is with some of the tape removed. It's been water damage, and there were some missing sections again because this page had gotten folded inside, and parts of it inside the cover, and parts of it had fallen off. This is the cover, also not in terribly good condition, but important to save. So one of the things that we concern ourselves with is trying to save every part of the original that we can, even if it's in poor condition, even if it's ugly. But if something comes with a work of art, whether it's a backboard or a label or anything that contributes to the information necessary for that piece, we try to save it. We may isolate it from the original piece, but we do try to save it. So here we have done some repair on those pages, and we've made what is called a 4-flap enclosure. So this is something that has been done for many, many years at the Library of Congress, and I think at institutions throughout the world, where you have something that's fragile. Maybe it can't be, maybe it's a pamphlet that can't be re-sewn, or it would be way too costly to try to put the whole thing back together. But in order to retain all the parts so they don't go missing, an enclosure is made for them out of an acid-free material. And this is what we call acid-free folder stock, meaning it has the weight and the stiffness of a manila folder. And we can custom make something where the flaps come over all 4 sides so nothing will get lost. Very simple to make, very easy to store, and then the 4-flap can get a label on the outside of it identifying the contents. So you'll always know what's inside. You don't always have to open it up and leaf through it to see what it is, what the artifact inside is. Here's just another view of the same document. And this is a detail of a very, very large wall map, a Russian wall map. It's actually a Soviet Union wall map that again had been all folded up and was missing margins so that the owner couldn't frame it or hang it in any way because the edges were way too irregular. So we filled them with a closely matching paper. The map itself had various kinds of stains on it, so we couldn't necessarily match all of them, but here we're just showing one corner, how we restored that squareness to it, so it can be used. Again, we don't necessarily draw back in the margins, and we certainly don't replace the information because we don't know what it is. And I can't write in Cyrillic, but we're not trying to restore again that map to its complete original condition. We're just trying to make it whole. This is the studio. I thought I'd show you a few shots of what it looks like with no one in it, of course. It is a very large studio. It's about, I only know in square feet, it's about 3,000 square feet. It has very large tables, and this particular table that you see in the middle is about 3.5 meters in length. But right now we have a number of artworks that are 4 meters in length, which is a problem. We try to keep, we have a lot of space in our studio so that people can move around it. We did work on a map on that table that was 4 meters by about 2.5 meters, maybe almost 3. And we had to extend the table to accommodate the whole map, but we didn't have any way of working in the middle. We didn't know how to get to the middle of the map. So we couldn't exactly build a bridge, but we did get from our local construction company something called a telescopic platform, and it's only about so wide. It's an aluminum platform, both sides of which extend out, so it goes from 8 feet to 12 feet. And we balanced that platform on one side on that cabinet that you see tucked over on the right, and on a ladder on the other side. So I then, and not gracefully, crawled out on my stomach across the ladder platform to work on the middle, because there was no other way to get there. It was interesting. Now here's another view of the same table. These are some books we've worked on. One of them is a Galileo from the mid-17th century. We do some rebinding, some sewing of books. And even though I don't have a picture of it, we did just 3 days ago return something that was one of the earliest things we had worked on in a while. It was a page printed by Gutenberg in 1460. So a very beautiful printed page, hand illuminated with color, with watercolor, from a Catholic encyclopedia. It's called the Catholicon. It was a very beautiful page, one of the earlier things we had ever gotten to work on. And I think I have maybe one more close-up. We also work on a number of both Chinese and Japanese books, which have a completely different kind of sewing structure and covering, and a lot of Asian scrolls and some screens. So it's pretty wide-ranging. The morning that I returned the Gutenberg page, which was kind of a thrill, I worked on an Andy Warhol in the afternoon, so kind of went from the sublime to the ridiculous. But and this is just another view. On the top right there's a loft, which is where we have a little dining area, so we don't have food in the lab. And this is the upstairs. It's not a full view of the upstairs. There's a big press that we use for flattening prints. Solvents, there's a big solvent cabinet downstairs, but this is where we use, this is where the majority of the work takes place. There's a big sink in this room that's 4 by 6 feet, where we do all the wet work. And this room upstairs has windows on 3 sides. So one of the great beauties of having this studio is that we get to work by natural light almost all year round, which is great. There are also skylights in that room. The bad thing is it's an old warehouse, so it's very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer. And these weights, which are old iron, they're not for attractiveness, although I do like them. They are what we weight things with. So virtually everything with paper needs to be weighted between blotters as it's flattened out. And we do need a fair amount of weight. Paper's stronger than you would ever imagine. I have a collection of maybe close to 60 of these irons. The ones you see here are between 4 and 5 pounds, but I have some that are, I'm trying to think in kilos, but I can't. I have some that are 18 to 26 pounds each. So we don't really need to go to the gym. I think that's it, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have at all. So.
You use different types of salts and other chemicals to remove the stains, the tapes and their adhesives. But at home also we have some old books, first edition. So how to keep them in good condition?
The most important thing to keep them in good condition is to try to limit their exposure to environmental changes. So actually putting them in a good quality box is the best answer, because then they're not subject to a lot of temperature changes and humidity changes and literally atmosphere, because the air is acidic. It's been acidic ever since the Industrial Revolution, and it's getting more so all the time. And paper will absorb whatever it's adjacent to. It doesn't always need moisture. It has enough moisture in it to begin with. So you want to limit what you use. But you were asking me what kind of...
Yeah, like you do these things professionally, so the kind of solutions that you use won't be accessible to us.
The majority of what we use is water.
Okay.
That is the most important solvent that we use. And we modify that water by adjusting the pH, because so much of what we're trying to address is the acidic content or the acidic stain in paper. So we use compounds like calcium hydroxide or magnesium sometimes to modify our filtered water to make it slightly more alkaline. That's 90% of what we use. For the tape, for example, if it's pressure-sensitive tape, then we have to use the harder stuff. So we use solvents like acetone and toluene and xylene and alcohol in a fume hood. We have a fume hood that we use. But seriously, most of what we do has to do with water. And so the most important thing is having access to good quality water. And the work that I've been doing in India, we have reverse osmosis water, which filters out a lot of the impurities that you would want to have eliminated, and then we adjust it with calcium hydroxide, so we can adjust the pH for that. But I mean, people think we have magic elixirs, but we really don't. It's really water. Good quality water is really the most important thing you could ever have in a conservation lab. I would say that for the other conservators.
Hi. So I had a question about creases. So when you creases in the document you're dealing with, maybe on a manuscript or on a paper, how do you do you take to filling them up? Can that be termed as restoration rather than conservation, or do you let the document with the creases intact?
We usually try to flatten things out, because those creases will end up eventually breaking or causing things to split. So we do a lot of items that we just flatten because they are more in danger of being damaged by being uneven. But if they're flat, you're preserving not just the paper, but whatever media is on that paper. So certainly if it's like a pastel or a charcoal, any kind of distortion in the paper would cause that media to pop off. But that's also true of printing ink. You do want paper to be relatively flat so that there isn't abrasion for parts of that ink. So flattening is important.
Fascinating talk. I have a curious question. So I don't know the exact date right now in the U.S. 1649 is the date which is being used as a sort of context for revision of history. I mean, there's all this in the New York Times. I forget the exact date that they're using. But this idea of history, of different kinds of history. So do you have an agenda?
Or I'm not quite
For
sure.
example, there's this whole discussion which I've read about in the U.S. which is going on about the founding of the Constitution, because slavery was embedded in the founding of the Constitution, and yet they said that all men are free. And so there was a fundamental contradiction. And similar to that, there's all these kinds of historical questioning which is going on, particularly in the U.S. So do you position yourself somewhere in this debate? I mean, do you...
Well, I'm not necessarily working with those documents, but I honestly think that every bit of information that can be salvaged adds to the discussion, even if some of it is painful and unattractive. So yes, my position is things need to be saved, and I don't know if this is quite the same thing, but we do work for a museum of World War II, and this collection has a great deal of Nazi memorabilia, and it is really awful. But the owner wants to make sure that it gets saved so that people will know the full extent of what happened during World War II in Germany and in Poland, etc. It's been hard working on some of it because it's repellent, but I do agree with him that it's important to know. So yeah, we do work on that. I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but I think what you're talking about might be this recent ascribing the date of 1619 as being the date of the first slaves being brought to America. And how that information comes out is precisely because of these documents that get found and revealed. And I think it's really exciting and important when you can come across something with that kind of historical importance and accuracy. I, being a private practice, don't always have access to them, but when I do, I'm pretty honored to work on them.
I have a couple of quick questions. One, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work in India, actually. I don't think so that just broadly,
Right.
How does that come about? What do you
and
do?
Haiti? Okay.
And where do you get material? What is the nature of the stuff that you deal with?
Well, this is how we met. How do you get material in India to do conservation? I've been working for 12 years. I think this is my 12th trip to India. I work at a private library up in the Punjab, and we work on old manuscripts that have been stored for a few centuries, not well, and they have all kinds of problems. They have either gotten wet and are stained, some have mold, some have been wrapped in rose petals and treated with turmeric and wrapped in silk, and very traditional ways of maybe storing things, but items that should have been stored differently. And they're also fragile and brittle, so we've been working on them to the extent possible. When I first started coming to India, I was given a little bit of a glimpse of one manuscript we would be working on, which took 5 years of my coming once a year. And what I knew right away was that everything in that manuscript was water sensitive. It was completely handwritten. It was hand illustrated. Everything was very, very sensitive to water, but it had stains on it. So I said, you need a suction table. You can't do that kind of work without a suction table. And we convinced them to have one manufactured, and they did. And that allowed us to work on this manuscript, which was 900 pages. And they were big pages. So that ability to have that piece of equipment, which is costly, but allowed us to localize our treatment and avoid that sensitive text and illustration, made all the difference. Now, could we make it perfect? No. We pretty much brought everything else with us. All our tools, our chemicals, our adhesives, all of our materials, lots of Japanese paper, lots of sheets of polyester that we use as release sheets. So every year, including this one, not me so much, but my colleagues are bringing large quantities of materials. And sometimes it's as simple as we have a large collection of acrylic paints there because we need to very often dye our papers so they more closely match the pages we're repairing. Japanese paper usually comes in a wide variety of whites and creams. It's not bleached, but it's very often much fresher looking than the pages we're repairing, which can be more tan or even brown. And rather than having what would look fairly unsightly or large white fills for the areas we have to replace, we try to come up with a more sympathetic color. And so we dye our own papers. We go to great lengths to try to do the best work we can with very limited resources, because once we're there, if we don't have it, we can't use it. So there's no FedEx. We can't, order something and expect it to be available. Now, one thing we have discovered in the last few years is there is a conservation supply company. It's an Italian company, but they do have a base in Delhi. And they do source all kinds of materials and solvents and tools, etc., as well as equipment that you can get here, but it's very expensive. I think almost everything is either from England or America. It's almost better to hand carry it. It's possible to get things from there, but it's expensive. It's a last resort. So what working here has really taught me is how to be inventive, how to be resourceful, because you can't always find what you want. So you have to think of different ways to go about your work so you don't just come to a complete halt because you don't have the right material. And that's something that I also learned when I went to work in Haiti. I'll just mention that for a second. Is that okay? After the big earthquake in Haiti, which destroyed so much of the country, killed so many people, there was an organization, or I should say a number of organizations that got together to see if they could try to save some of their cultural heritage. And at the time I thought, that's crazy. They need housing and they need medical help. They don't need their art saved. But I was wrong. Because Haiti, like so many other countries, so much of their culture involved their music and their art and their murals and their banners. So much of what they do is in the visual arts as well as in their archives. So I did go there about 4 months after the earthquake to see what could be salvaged. And then I went back again the following year to teach other students about paper, about what they could do to just stabilize it, to house it properly. These were always very limited visits, which was kind of heartbreaking, but it was important because it was a way, and I was not the only paper conservator who went. There were a number of us over a period of 2 years to go in and just say, you need to know how to take better care of these things, how to house them. So many of the things that we saw actually were damaged well before the earthquake. They didn't have any protocol in place for how to take care of paper. So things were repaired with Scotch tape, and they were glued down to boards with terrible adhesives and all the usual atrocities that we see. So a lot of that damage had occurred before we even got there, but then it was a question of how do we make sure it doesn't get worse, and how do we put things in good condition. And I had very limited resources there. What I did have was a large room filled with damaged artifacts in a short period of time, and no supervision. So it was kind of perfect because I could go in and prioritize the things that I thought were the most important to save. It was just my opinion, but I thought they were the most important. Or B, the ones that I could do start to finish within the period of time I had. So I worked on both archival material and some art, and just in the very, very focused way, working 10 hours a day. It was wonderful, but I had one table, one chair, a little bit of water. I had sunlight. I didn't have trays, so I took, to do any kind of wet cleaning, so I took heavy pieces of mylar or Melanex polyester and folded them up and stapled them to make corners, so I'd have some kind of a little tray. You figure out things to work with when you don't really have what you're used to, and it makes you appreciate when you do have it home that much more. There was another question in the back, maybe, if we remember.
My question was regarding the print. Hello. The question was regarding the print. So when you either handwritten or printed material, how do you predetermine as in like what kind of treatment this could stand, and if at all required, do you so it's kind of a restoration part, but like write over it or add more print to it?
That's a really good question. That is very familiar. We could have a print that in and of itself is very stable. It might be an old engraving, but someone has written on it in manuscript ink, and that manuscript ink is water sensitive, so that print cannot be washed. We could either try to apply a fixative over the signature, which I'm not very crazy about, or we can try to wash that print under suction again, masking off that area, or we don't do anything because we can't. Sometimes it's too risky because something has been written or stamped on an artifact, and we know we can't get around it, and we simply have to say no. I did that the day before I came here with some Chinese books, really, really fragile Chinese books. They have a soft paper cover, not a hard cover, and some child had scribbled on the front cover in ballpoint pens, and ballpoint pen will bleed badly with moisture, and so I said I can't treat them. There's nothing I can do. Does that answer the question? So to test things, we have tiny, tiny little micro swabs, little cotton swabs, but they're extremely small, and we can dampen them and just just barely touch an inscription, an ink, a watercolor, and if something comes up and it's really tiny, we know immediately that we have a problem, we have something we have to address. And we can keep going until we find out if it's stable. In terms of whether we ever go over it again, we're not supposed to. It's just that simple. There are things that come in, let's say by a famous artist, like a Picasso lithograph, who often signed his prints with a red pencil, and it fades like crazy. And the owner will say, well, can you just go over it and enhance it? And no, the answer is no. There have been a few times when I have broken that rule, and it was because the item was personal and important and only had relevance to that owner. So this is the one that most comes to mind. A gentleman who had served in the Korean War had been given a handwritten thank you by the village where he was stationed, and it was in Korean, and it had faded. And he really wanted to be, it mattered to him. It didn't have much historical importance beyond himself and his family, but he really couldn't read it very legibly anymore. I don't know Korean, but I do know the order of strokes because I studied Chinese. So I did. I went over the entire document with some kind of ink, and so it was legible again, and he was extremely happy, and I knew I wasn't going to go to conservation heaven, but you know, it was one of those decisions you make, but that was the 1%. 99% of the time, we can't enhance, we can't strengthen or go over. It's just, it's not what we do, but we do something else. See, my snap is kicking in, I'm thinking more. That's not an unfamiliar situation where something has lost its strength or its legibility. We can have that document, it's always documents, not art. We can have it digitized, have a really high resolution photograph taken of it. And on the computer, whatever is greatly faded can be enhanced. Then that enhanced digital version can be printed out, and the owner can have that document to enjoy, and the original is kept. The original is really not in any way touched or changed, and they can have both. And this is something we do actually a lot. Well, we don't do the digitizing, but there is an organization, what do they call it? The Scottish Rite Temple in California had a number of documents, quite large, big documents on both paper and parchment, and they were their founding charter documents. The majority of them had all been printed, they had been engraved, but the names of the principal people, founders, were in red ink, and they had faded. And they wanted to know what I could do. So I said, I can nicely flatten out the originals, but we have them digitized. All of the faded ink was enhanced on the computer. Those enhanced documents were printed out by a really excellent printer so that all the nuances of the original paper were present. They framed the digitized version, and then they had a flash drive with those digitized versions, so in the future they could make multiple copies of them. We made a clamshell box for the originals, and they framed the enhanced ones that could now be read. They could see the founders. Today my staff is picking up a number of things from the digitizers. These are all family documents that needed copies. And maybe there were family members that wanted copies of them, and they wanted to know how to get one for each of the people. And then we can give them a CD or a flash drive, and they will have access as long as there's technology to read that somewhere. So we know our limits. I think that's really important to know. Technology has helped us a lot to provide items for our clients that will allow them to keep the information, even though the originals are a little bit too far gone. So we always save the originals, and then we give them the opportunity to have another version of something. And so they can hand them out to their families who want that kind of knowledge. But we can't do everything.
I think that's a really good note to end on.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Karen.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
can't do everything.